So one of my therapist's excuses for why Lenape Valley had jumped to the idiotic conclusions they did is because some of the therapists, like her supervisor, now she didn't take responsibility, nor did she contradict her original statement that it was her supervisor that Googled me and decided that, these crazy things. And she said that, some of the therapists that work there have vicarious trauma. Well, number one, I have legitimate trauma, which is why I was in therapy. I have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why I was in therapy. Okay? So, what I want to point out here, now, when I worked in mental health, I had to help prepare, and I was one of the planned speakers. It was not initiated until after I left. I was one of the planned presenters for the trauma-informed training of Pendel Mental Health Center. Now, I helped to create the trauma-informed training curriculum, but I never actually was one of the people that presented it because I left prior to them. I was fired prior to it being implemented. But what you need to understand, despite what all these idiots want to assume, trauma is not an excuse to be a dickhead. Okay? One of the problems you have is people want this concept where nobody is at fault for anything they do because they had a bad childhood, or they were beaten up as a kid, or they were sexually assaulted as a kid, or something happened to them, or they were, they were mugged, or they were in a house fire, or they were in a war, or they were a concentration camp survivor, or Roman Polanski, who was found to be violating children, was considered, somebody called into one of the local radio shows here and said he shouldn't have been charged with anything because he survived a concentration camp, which I don't even know if that's factual, but that's like saying if something bad happened to you, you have a free pass to do whatever the hell you want for the rest of your life. So what people don't like about me is people like to try and they want to push their limits with me, and they want to think they can get away with shit, and I don't let them get away with shit, so then I'm the bad guy. Okay? A mental health diagnosis is not an excuse to be an asshole either. Okay? Now I try to give people chance after chance after chance. That was one of my problems with a certain moron from a certain South American country. I tried very hard not to be rough on her because of her diagnosis. Didn't work out too well for me, did it? So, the vast majority of individuals meeting the diagnostic criteria, this is what you have to understand. This is why a mental health diagnosis is not an excuse. The majority of people with mental health diagnoses don't go around fucking with people. Okay? So the vast majority of individuals meeting the criteria for trauma-related stress disorders do not actively harm others. No amount of trauma exempts a traumatized person from being held accountable for hurting others. To utilize trauma as an excuse for harmful behavior avoids responsibility for one's actions and forestalls healing and growth. Now, what you also need to understand, I think the country, if society was run like the military, there'd be a hell of a lot less problems. So, if, for example, Lenape Valley Foundation was run like the military, and they had therapists that were making ridiculous decisions that had no basis in reality based on their vicarious trauma, they would be evaluated and honorably medically discharged for being insane. And that's what Lenape Valley needs to do with whoever is responsible, whether it's one person or a slew of people that is responsible for what the fuck happened with me. So trauma is an experience that overwhelms our ability to cope, undermines our sense of safety. Trauma can inspire powerlessness and hopelessness. Relative to our capacity to defend ourselves, it can rob us. In my opinion, I think that a lot of this, what people need to understand, once you accept the reality that you are more or less powerless. Like I said, when I started getting involved in the 8 laws of health, that last one, number 8, trust in God, okay? And like I said, what you got to understand is you don't have all power. I don't necessarily trust God, okay? I don't trust anything. But what I accept is the fact, shit happens. And it's outside my control, and there's nothing I can do about it. Now, I can worry about shit that I can't control, or I can accept shit. There's a lot of shit that can happen to me. In reality, I have no real rights, unless those rights are enforced by society, which is why I fight so hard for society to uphold the rights that it promises, okay? Because, like Mussolini, I believe that the state is responsible for our rights. They don't come from some magical place, okay? Our rights are agreed upon social norms that are decided upon by people that say, yes, these are rights you deserve, okay? And one of them is the right to feel secure. Now, when that right has been violated by people that have been erroneously and that are too irresponsible, whether it's because of trauma or because they're insane or because they're just bitches, it doesn't really matter. What matters is they can't be making these decisions and they need to be held accountable, which is why I don't mince my words when it comes to calling these people out. So, yes, but the thing is, trauma can inspire powerlessness and hopelessness relative to our capacity to defend ourselves. I think personally that you can make a lot of headway in healing when you realize that there's a lot that you are powerless against. And to be quite honest, there's not a lot of hope. When you actually accept the reality, when you accept reality on reality's terms, I think that's when you can begin to heal. If you keep trying to live in this imaginary world of bullshit, you're not going to get nowhere. And a lot of these therapists, They live in these imaginary worlds of bullshit, empowered by their horse crap that they learned in feminist training camp and LGBTQIAP+++++ summer camp, and it doesn't mesh with reality. And therefore, they think that if they're traumatized or if they're triggered or if they feel blah, 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 well, now their client is being ableist and being mean to them. Their client is the one there for help. And I saw this shit when I worked in mental health. Bad enough I saw it when I worked there. I'm not going to allow myself to be a victim of it while I'm receiving treatment. Okay? Many studies estimate that the vast majority of us, over 70% of people, allegedly, are exposed to at least one major trauma. Think of witnessing death or serious injury, unexpectedly losing a loved one. Does this mean that this is an excuse? No, what this means is there are a lot of people that need to learn to heal. Okay? I've unfortunately experienced a lot of trauma, and a lot of that trauma has been created by the mental health industry. So trauma is not, therefore, an excuse for perpetuating harm and suffering, as my therapist did, as her supervisor did, as the staff at Lenape Valley did. Trauma is not an excuse for perpetuating harm and suffering. Trauma is not an excuse for perpetuating harm and suffering. So what is vicarious trauma? Vicarious trauma is PTSD for pussies. Dealing with personal trauma is challenging, but so is helping others work through their trauma, and it may result in vicarious trauma. Okay? When I worked in mental health, this is the way I look at it. My trauma, and I have real trauma, never made me treat somebody unfairly. I had clients when I worked in mental health that straight up threatened to take my life because I wasn't the same race as them. Okay? I still provided them with services. I still did. Now, I suggested that they receive services from somebody that was the same race as them, but I was denied that. I was told that I was racist after somebody threatened to literally take my life because I didn't happen to be the same race as them. But, whatever. If you spend your day taking care of other people, you may be taking on their stress experiences. No shit. This form of trauma is not well known, so many people experiencing it. This form of trauma is well known. It's been well known. Vicarious trauma is the accruing effect of being exposed to someone else's trauma that you have not personally experienced, but you've learned about from others. The Vicarious Trauma Institute, they have a whole institute dedicated to vicarious trauma, defines vicarious trauma as the indirect exposure to trauma through first-hand account of narrative of traumatic event, vicarious, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now what's funny about that, when I worked in mental health, I had plenty of people that explained trauma to me that was clearly imaginary. And by imaginary, I don't mean that it was like they were making it up for fun. I mean that it was based on delusions. Okay? It was obvious that some of the things that many of my clients told me about traumatic experiences that they had, they believed that it happened to them, but there is no way, considering the physical laws of nature, that some of the things could happen. And these include abuses at the hands of cults and things like that, government conspiracies against them, things like that. Okay? So, of course, do I believe that they believe that these things happen to them? Yes. Do I believe that maybe something happened to them that they believe was caused by this or that situation? Yes. However, being somebody working in the field of mental health, I had to understand that the people that I'm working with weren't mentally well and may not be able to understand reality on reality's terms. Ergo, I had to understand that these people, while their trauma was real to them, it was not real to me. I had my own shit, my own problems, but these people's problems were not my problems. Vicarious trauma is known by a handful of other names: secondary traumatization, secondary trauma, secondhand trauma, secondary trauma, traumatic stress. Okay, my point is, I think that a lot of people that work in mental health, if instead of being chocked full of LGBTQIAP++++ trigger warnings and all this bullshit, if they were actually taught to think, to actually measure things against reality and what they know to be reality, maybe they wouldn't be so vicariously traumatized moving forward. So what is vicarious trauma? Vicarious trauma is an occupational challenge for people working and volunteering in fields of victim services, law enforcement, emergency medical services, fire services, and other allied professions due to their continuous exposure to victims' trauma. What happens to those exposed to vicarious trauma introduces a new model for examining, conceptualizing, blah, 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 blah. Read this on your own. This is talking about how there is work-related trauma exposure, blah, 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 blah. Most of my trauma at work was from my supervisor being a fucking lunatic. Moving forward. 3 things your trauma is not an excuse for. Your trauma is not an excuse for failing to take responsibility. Your trauma is not an excuse for your bad behavior. Your trauma is not an excuse for having everyone walk on eggshells. More so, what you have to understand, if I'm in therapy, I shouldn't have to walk on eggshells with my therapist like I had to do. My therapist should not get a pass for their inability to do their job because of trauma. And trauma is not an excuse to not take responsibility for whatever the fuck you do. And that's all for this video.